The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Afghan mountains as Captain Jake Morrison crouched behind a boulder, his heart pounding against his chest. Around him, 249 other Marines lay scattered among the jagged rocks, their faces painted with dust and determination. What had started as a routine patrol mission 12 hours earlier had turned into their worst nightmare. Morrison pressed his radio closer to his ear, trying to catch any signal through the static. The Taliban fighters had appeared from nowhere, emerging from caves and hidden positions like ghosts materializing from the mountain itself. The ambush had been perfectly planned, cutting off every escape route the Marines might have taken back to their base. The sound of gunfire echoed through the valley as bullets ricocheted off the stones around them. Morrison could see the muzzle flashes from at least 50 different positions surrounding their location. The enemy had them completely encircled, trapped in what military strategists would later call a perfect kill zone. Private Rodriguez crawled over to Morrison, his uniform torn and bloodied from a grazing bullet wound on his arm. "Sir, we've counted at least 300 hostiles in the surrounding hills," he whispered urgently. "They've got us pinned down from every direction. No way out on foot?" Morrison nodded grimly, studying the terrain through his binoculars. The Taliban had chosen their ambush site carefully. The Marines were trapped in a narrow valley with steep cliffs on 3 sides and a heavily fortified position, blocking the only exit. Any attempt to climb the cliffs would leave them exposed to enemy fire for several minutes, making them easy targets. The radio crackled to life with desperate voices from his squad leaders reporting their positions and casualty counts. So far they had been lucky with only minor injuries, but Morrison knew their ammunition wouldn't last forever. The enemy seemed content to wait them out, occasionally firing bursts to keep the Marines pinned down while reinforcements continued to arrive. Sergeant Williams crawled over with the latest ammunition count. "Captain, at our current rate of fire, we've got maybe 4 hours of ammo left," he reported. "The men are starting to ask questions about extraction." Morrison looked up at the clear blue sky, hoping to spot the familiar silhouette of rescue helicopters, but saw nothing except circling vultures. He knew that conventional helicopter rescue would be impossible in this terrain, surrounded by enemy forces with rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns positioned on the high ground. As the hours passed, the situation grew more desperate. The Taliban fighters grew bolder, moving closer to the Marine positions under cover of suppressive fire. Morrison could hear them calling to each other in Pashto, coordinating what appeared to be preparation for a final assault. The temperature soared past 100 degrees, and the Marines' water supplies were running dangerously low. Several men showed signs of heat exhaustion, their faces flushed and breathing labored in the thin mountain air. Morrison knew they needed a miracle, and they needed it soon. Young Corporal Henderson, barely 19 years old, looked at Morrison with frightened eyes. "Captain, are we going to make it out of here?" he asked quietly. Morrison placed a reassuring hand on the young Marine's shoulder, projecting confidence he didn't entirely feel. "We're Marines, Henderson. We don't leave anyone behind and we don't give up. Help is coming." But as he spoke those words, Morrison wondered if he was lying to himself as much as to his men. The radio remained mostly silent except for static, and no rescue seemed possible given their impossible situation. The Taliban continued to tighten their noose around the trapped Marines, and time was running out fast. 200 miles away at Forward Operating Base Chapman, Navy helicopter pilot Lieutenant Commander Sarah Phoenix Chen stood in the briefing room, staring at the tactical map spread across the table. The red circle marking the Marines' position looked impossibly small compared to the vast enemy territory surrounding it. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, had just finished explaining the situation to the assembled rescue team. His face was grim as he pointed to the intelligence reports scattered across the table. "The Marines have been trapped for 14 hours now. Every conventional rescue attempt would be suicide." Chen studied the topographical maps, her trained eye analyzing the terrain features and potential approach routes. At 32 years old, she had already flown more combat rescue missions than most pilots twice her age. Her call sign, Phoenix, had been earned after she successfully crash-landed a damaged helicopter and walked away without a scratch, only to volunteer for another mission the same day. Major Thompson, the mission commander, shook his head as he reviewed the intelligence photos. "The Taliban have positioned anti-aircraft weapons on every ridgeline. They're using Soviet-era Zu-23 guns and RPGs. Any helicopter approaching that valley would be shot down before getting within 2 miles of the Marines. The other pilots in the room shifted uncomfortably, knowing that Thompson was right. The enemy had created an impenetrable air defense network around the trapped Marines. Traditional rescue helicopters like the heavy-lift Chinooks couldn't maneuver quickly enough to avoid the incoming fire, and even the faster Blackhawks would struggle against such concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Chen traced her finger along a narrow canyon that wound through the mountains, studying the approach angles and potential cover. "What about a low-level approach through the Khyber Ravine?" she asked quietly. Thompson looked at her with disbelief. "Phoenix, that ravine is barely wide enough for a helicopter. The walls are vertical granite cliffs rising 800 feet on both sides. One mistake and you'd be splattered against the rocks." But Chen's mind was already working through the possibilities. She had flown through similar terrain during training exercises in the Rocky Mountains, threading her helicopter through canyons that seemed impossibly narrow. The key was maintaining perfect control while flying at speeds that left no margin for error. "The enemy wouldn't expect an approach from that direction," she continued, her voice growing more confident. "Their anti-aircraft positions are all focused on the main valleys. If I could navigate through the ravine at maximum speed, I might be able to reach the Marines before the Taliban could react." Chief Warrant Officer Davis, Chen's usual co-pilot, studied the map over her shoulder. They had flown together for 3 years, and he knew that look in her eyes. "Phoenix, even if you could make it through the ravine, how would you extract 250 Marines? A single helicopter can't carry that many people." Chen had already considered this problem. "We wouldn't extract them all at once. Multiple trips, taking out the wounded first, then the others in groups of 20. But we'd need to establish a secure landing zone and hold it long enough for the extractions." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the enormity of what Chen was proposing. It would require flying multiple missions through enemy territory, landing in a hot zone surrounded by hostile forces, and somehow maintaining control of the situation long enough to evacuate all the Marines. Colonel Martinez leaned forward, his weathered face showing the strain of command. "Phoenix, what you're describing isn't a rescue mission, it's a death wish. The odds of survival are virtually zero." Chen met his gaze steadily. "Sir, those Marines didn't ask to be abandoned in that valley. They were following orders, doing their job. Now it's our turn to do ours." She paused, looking around the room at the other pilots. "I've studied the terrain, run the calculations. It's possible, but it has to be done precisely and without hesitation." Major Thompson picked up the intelligence report about enemy troop concentrations. "Even if you somehow made it to the Marines, you'd be landing in the middle of 300 Taliban fighters. They'd overwhelm your position in minutes." But Chen was already formulating the details of her plan. She knew it would require perfect timing, incredible skill, and more luck than any pilot had a right to expect. However, looking at the faces of the trapped Marines in the reconnaissance photos, she knew she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try. "I need a volunteer crew," she announced quietly. "This mission is completely voluntary. Anyone who wants out can leave right now, no questions asked." The room remained silent for a long moment before Chief Davis stepped forward. "I'm in," he said simply. "Those are our people out there." The black helicopter lifted off from Forward Operating Base Chapman, just as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Chen had chosen to fly the mission at night, hoping the cover of darkness would provide additional protection from enemy fire. Her modified Black Hawk had been stripped of all unnecessary weight and loaded with extra fuel tanks for the long journey ahead. Chief Davis occupied the co-pilot seat, his hands moving steadily across the instrument panel as he monitored their systems. Behind them, Sergeant First Class Marcus Johnson manned the door gun, his eyes scanning the terrain below for any signs of enemy activity. Johnson had volunteered for the mission despite having only 2 weeks left before his scheduled return home. The flight to the canyon entrance took 90 minutes, during which Chen flew at extremely low altitude to avoid enemy radar. The helicopter skimmed just 50 feet above the rocky ground, weaving between hills and following dry riverbeds to mask their approach. The tension in the cockpit was palpable as they drew closer to hostile territory. "Phoenix, we're approaching the Khyber Ravine entrance," Davis announced, checking their GPS coordinates against the map. "Canyon walls rise to 800 feet. Width varies between 40 and 60 feet. Chen could see the dark mouth of the canyon ahead, looking like a wound carved into the mountainside. The walls rose almost vertically on both sides, creating a narrow passage that seemed barely wide enough for their helicopter. She reduced speed and began her approach, knowing that once they entered the canyon, there would be no room for mistakes. The helicopter slipped between the towering rock walls like a knife blade entering a sheath. Chen's hands were steady on the controls, but she could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool night air. The rotor blades were spinning just 20 feet from the canyon walls on each side, creating a deafening echo that bounced back and forth between the granite cliffs. 40 feet of clearance on the port side, 35 on starboard, Davis called out, his voice tense but professional. The canyon was even narrower than the maps had indicated, forcing Chen to fly with precision that left no margin for error. The helicopter's powerful spotlight illuminated the canyon floor ahead, revealing a winding path that snaked through the mountains like a serpent. Chen followed each twist and turn with careful adjustments to her flight path, sometimes banking so steeply that the rotor tips seemed to scrape against the stone walls. 15 minutes into the canyon flight, they encountered their first major obstacle. The passage narrowed to barely 30 feet wide, with a sharp turn to the left followed immediately by an even sharper turn to the right. Chen reduced speed to just above stall velocity, knowing that too much speed would make the turns impossible. "This is insane," Johnson muttered from his position at the door gun, watching the rock walls flash past just inches from the helicopter's fuselage. One downdraft and we're pancaked against those cliffs. But Chen remained focused, her years of training taking over as she navigated through the impossible terrain. She could feel the helicopter responding to every subtle input, the machine becoming an extension of her own body as she threaded through the narrow passages. Halfway through the canyon, disaster nearly struck. A sudden crosswind caught the helicopter as they rounded a sharp bend, pushing them toward the eastern wall. Chen reacted instantly, applying opposite rudder and adjusting the collective to counter the wind's effect. The rotor tips missed the rock face by less than 5 feet. "That was too close," Davis breathed, his knuckles white as he gripped his seat. "Phoenix, maybe we should abort and find another approach." Chen shook her head, her eyes never leaving the canyon ahead. "We're committed now. The Marines are counting on us, and this is the only way in that won't get us shot down." As they progressed deeper into the canyon, the walls began to show signs of the ancient geological forces that had carved this passage. Strange rock formations jutted out from the sides, creating additional obstacles that Chen had to navigate around. The helicopter's engines echoed off the walls, creating a symphony of sound that seemed to come from all directions. Near the end of the canyon, they encountered the most challenging section yet. The passage made an almost 90-degree turn to the left while simultaneously dropping in elevation. Chen would have to execute a complex maneuver that combined banking, descending and turning all at the same time. "Here we go," she whispered, beginning the intricate sequence of control inputs that would carry them through the final obstacle. The helicopter seemed to dance through the air, responding to Chen's expert touch as she guided them around the treacherous bend. As they emerged from the canyon into the valley beyond, Chen felt a surge of relief mixed with anticipation. They had successfully navigated the most dangerous part of their journey. But now came the even more challenging task of reaching the trapped Marines and somehow extracting them from their impossible situation. Captain Morrison heard the distant sound of rotor blades cutting through the night air and felt his heart skip a beat. After 18 hours of being trapped with no word from command, the sound was like music to his ears. He grabbed his radio and switched to the emergency frequency. "Unknown aircraft. This is Reaper 6. If you can hear this transmission, we have 250 Marines pinned down and in desperate need of extraction," he whispered into the microphone, hoping the Taliban fighters couldn't hear him over the sound of the approaching helicopter. Chen's voice crackled through the static. "Reaper 6, this is Phoenix 1. I see your position. We're coming in for extraction, but I need you to mark your perimeter with infrared strobes. This is going to be a hot landing." Morrison quickly passed the word to his squad leaders to prepare the infrared markers that would be visible only through night vision equipment. The strobes would help Chen identify the Marine positions without alerting the enemy to the rescue attempt. As Chen's helicopter approached the valley where the Marines were trapped, she could see muzzle flashes from dozens of Taliban positions surrounding the rocky outcrop where Morrison's men had taken cover. The enemy had maintained their siege throughout the night, apparently confident that no rescue would be possible. "Phoenix, I count approximately 40 enemy positions on the high ground," Davis reported, studying the terrain through his night vision scope. They've got the Marines completely surrounded with overlapping fields of fire. Chen studied the situation below, looking for any possible landing zone within the Marine perimeter. The area was smaller than a football field, littered with boulders and steep slopes that would make a normal landing impossible. She would have to attempt what pilots called a pinnacle landing on the narrow ridge where the Marines had taken their final defensive position. Reaper 6, I'm going to put down on the ridge approximately 50 meters west of your position, Chen radioed to Morrison. I can only stay on the ground for 60 seconds maximum. Have your wounded ready to load immediately. Morrison acknowledged and began organizing his casualties. They had 7 wounded Marines, including 3 with serious injuries that required immediate medical attention. He assigned his strongest men to carry the wounded to the helicopter, while the others provided covering fire. As Chen began her descent, the Taliban fighters finally realized what was happening. Suddenly, the night sky erupted with tracer fire as dozens of weapons opened up on the helicopter. Red and green lines of light streaked past the aircraft as Chen fought to maintain control while under intense enemy fire. Taking heavy fire from multiple positions, Johnson shouted from his door gun, returning fire at the muzzle flashes he could see on the surrounding ridges. RPG launch from the eastern ridge. Chen saw the rocket-propelled grenade streaking toward them and threw the helicopter into a violent evasive maneuver, banking hard to the right just as the explosive warhead detonated, where they had been flying seconds earlier. The blast wave rocked the aircraft, but they remained airborne. Phoenix 1, abort the landing. Major Thompson's voice came through the radio from the command center. The zone is too hot. You'll never make it down alive. But Chen was already committed to the landing. She could see the infrared strobes marking the Marine positions and knew that Morrison's men were depending on her. Negative control. These Marines have been trapped for 18 hours. I'm going in. The helicopter dropped toward the rocky ridge with bullets striking the fuselage and shattering the side windows. Chen fought to maintain a stable approach while Johnson and Davis returned fire at the enemy positions. The sound of bullets hitting metal mixed with the roar of the engines created a terrifying symphony of combat. Morrison and his Marines watched in amazement as the black helicopter descended. Through the storm of enemy fire, several Taliban fighters had moved closer to the Marine positions, apparently hoping to prevent the rescue by engaging the helicopter during its most vulnerable moment. All squads, lay down suppressive fire, Morrison ordered over his radio. Give that pilot every bit of cover we can. The Marines opened up with everything they had, sending a wall of bullets toward the enemy positions. The concentrated fire forced many of the Taliban fighters to take cover, reducing the incoming fire on Chen's helicopter just enough to allow her to continue the landing approach. The helicopter touched down on the narrow ridge with a bone-jarring impact, the landing gear settling onto the uneven rocky surface. Chen kept the engines running at full power, knowing they would need to take off again within seconds. Go, go, go! Morrison shouted to his men carrying the wounded. The Marines rushed toward the helicopter through the chaos of gunfire, struggling to load their injured comrades into the aircraft while bullets whined overhead. Johnson helped pull the wounded Marines into the helicopter, while continuing to fire his door gun at enemy positions. One of the injured Marines, Corporal Sanders, had taken shrapnel in his leg and was losing blood rapidly. Johnson applied pressure to the wound while guiding the Marine into the aircraft. That's 7 wounded on board, Johnson reported to Chen. We're at maximum capacity. Chen could see more. Taliban fighters moving toward their position, apparently preparing for a final assault to prevent the helicopter from taking off. Reaper 6, we have to go now. Mark your position and wait for my return. As the helicopter lifted off under heavy fire, Morrison watched it disappear into the darkness, carrying his wounded men to safety. For the first time in 18 hours, he felt a glimmer of hope that they might actually survive this impossible situation. Chen's helicopter raced through the darkness toward the field hospital at Forward Operating Base Chapman, carrying the 7 wounded Marines to safety. The flight back through the canyon was equally treacherous, but adrenaline and determination drove Chen to push her aircraft to its absolute limits. At the field hospital, medical teams were standing by to receive the casualties. As soon as the helicopter touched down, doctors and nurses rushed forward to unload the wounded Marines. Chen watched them carry Corporal Sanders into the trauma unit, knowing that her quick action had saved his life. Chief Davis was already calculating fuel consumption and ammunition supplies for the return trip. Phoenix, we used 60% of our ammo on that first run. The Taliban know we're coming now, so they'll be ready for us. Chen nodded grimly as the ground crew refueled her helicopter and reloaded the ammunition for Johnson's door gun. She had successfully extracted 7 Marines, but 243 more remained trapped in that valley, surrounded by an increasingly desperate enemy force. Colonel Martinez approached the helicopter as the refueling was completed. Phoenix, intelligence reports indicate the Taliban are moving additional fighters into the area. They're determined to prevent any further rescue attempts. But Chen was already climbing back into the pilot's seat. Sir, those Marines are counting on us. We're going back. The second trip through the canyon was even more challenging than the first. The Taliban had apparently figured out the rescue route and positioned fighters along the canyon walls. As Chen's helicopter navigated through the narrow passage, enemy fighters fired down from the cliffs above, their bullets ricocheting off the rock walls in deadly spray patterns. Taking fire from above, Johnson reported, rotating his gun upward to return fire at the muzzle flashes on the canyon rim. They're dropping grenades into the canyon. Chen increased speed, racing through the passages faster than she had ever flown before. Hand grenades exploded against the canyon floor behind them, sending shrapnel bouncing off the helicopter's armored fuselage. The sound of metal fragments striking the aircraft mixed with the roar of the engines in a terrifying cacophony. When they reached the Marine position for the second time, the situation had deteriorated significantly. The Taliban had moved closer to the Marine perimeter, apparently emboldened by the knowledge that helicopters were attempting rescues. Morrison's men were engaged in close-quarter combat with enemy fighters who had infiltrated to within 50 meters of their defensive positions. Reaper 6. The landing zone is compromised, Chen radioed to Morrison. I'm going to have to hover while you load the Marines. Morrison acknowledged and organized his next group of 20 Marines to board the helicopter. But as Chen approached the landing zone, an RPG streaked toward the aircraft from a concealed position. She jerked the controls hard to the left, causing the helicopter to slip sideways just as the rocket exploded against the cliff face. The blast wave caught the helicopter's tail rotor, causing severe vibrations that threatened to tear the aircraft apart. Chen fought for control as warning lights flashed across her instrument panel, indicating critical damage to the tail rotor assembly. We've got serious damage, Davis reported, his voice tense as he monitored the aircraft systems. Tail rotor efficiency is down to 40%. We're barely maintaining directional control. Despite the damage, Chen managed to establish a hover over the Marine position. Using every bit of skill she possessed, she held the crippled helicopter steady while Morrison's men climbed aboard. The aircraft shuddered and shook as she fought against the damaged tail rotor, but she refused to abandon the Marines. 20 more on board, Johnson confirmed as the last Marine climbed into the aircraft. We're seriously overloaded and this bird is barely flying. The overloaded helicopter struggled to gain altitude as Chen nursed it away from the landing zone. The damaged tail rotor made every control input a battle, and she knew they were lucky to be airborne at all. The flight back to base was a nightmare of mechanical problems and emergency procedures. At Forward Operating Base Chapman, the maintenance crews worked frantically to repair the helicopter, while Chen grabbed a quick meal and studied intelligence updates about the situation at the Marine position. The Taliban had increased their forces to nearly 500 fighters, all focused on preventing further rescue attempts. The third rescue mission launched just before dawn, with Chen flying a different helicopter since her original aircraft required extensive repairs. This time she approached from a different direction, hoping to surprise the enemy forces who had adjusted their positions to counter her previous routes. But the Taliban were learning too. As Chen's helicopter approached the Marine position, it flew into a carefully prepared ambush. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire from multiple directions, creating a web of tracer fire that seemed impossible to penetrate. Chen dove toward the ground, using the terrain to mask her approach while bullets shattered the helicopter's windows. This is insane, Davis muttered, ducking as a line of bullets stitched across the cockpit just inches above their heads. They're throwing everything they have at us. Chen ignored the fear in her co-pilot's voice and focused on reaching Morrison's position. She could see the Marines fighting desperately against overwhelming odds, their ammunition running critically low after more than 20 hours of continuous combat. She knew that this might be their last chance for rescue. Reaper 6, I'm coming in fast and hot, she radioed to Morrison. Have your next group ready to board immediately. I can't hold position for more than 30 seconds. As the helicopter dropped toward the Marine position under heavy fire, Chen realized that each rescue mission was becoming more dangerous than the last. The Taliban were adapting their tactics, and she was running out of ways to surprise them. But looking at the faces of the trapped Marines below, she knew she would continue flying into that hell until every last one of them was safe. By dawn, Chen had completed 6 rescue missions, successfully extracting 167 Marines from the surrounded position. But the cost had been enormous. Her helicopter had been hit multiple times, and Johnson had been wounded by shrapnel from an exploding RPG. Despite his injuries, the door gunner refused to be evacuated, insisting on continuing the mission. Morrison now had only 83 Marines left in his defensive perimeter, and their ammunition was nearly exhausted. The Taliban had grown increasingly desperate as the night wore on, launching several direct assaults against the Marine positions. Each attack had been repelled, but at a terrible cost in ammunition and energy. "Reaper 6, this is Phoenix 1, Chen's voice crackled through Morrison's radio. "Intelligence reports the enemy is preparing for a final assault at sunrise. I'm coming in for the remaining Marines, but this has to be our last run." Morrison looked around at his remaining men. They were exhausted, dirty, and low on ammunition, but their eyes still held the determination that made them Marines. Many of them had volunteered to be in the final group, insisting that others go first despite the increasing danger. Chen's helicopter approached the valley as the first rays of sunlight painted the mountains in shades of gold and red. The beautiful sunrise seemed cruelly out of place in the midst of such violence and destruction. As the aircraft descended toward the Marine position, the Taliban launched their most coordinated attack yet. Enemy fighters emerged from concealed positions all around the valley, rushing toward the Marine perimeter, while heavy weapons provided covering fire. Chen could see dozens of muzzle flashes as the Taliban fighters opened up with everything they had, determined to overrun the position before the final rescue could be completed. "We're flying into a hornet's nest," Davis observed, watching the tracer fire crisscross the valley below. "They're not even trying to hide anymore. It's a full-scale assault." Chen pushed the helicopter into a steep dive, racing toward the Marine position faster than she had ever flown before. She knew that Morrison's men couldn't hold their position much longer against such overwhelming numbers. This rescue had to succeed, or the remaining Marines would be overrun. Johnson, despite his wounds, maintained steady fire with his door gun as they approached the landing zone. His accurate shooting helped suppress several enemy positions, giving the Marines precious seconds to organize their final defensive efforts. Phoenix 1. "The landing zone is overrun," Morrison reported over the radio. "Taliban fighters are inside our perimeter. Abort the landing and save yourselves." But Chen could see Morrison and his Marines fighting desperately against enemy fighters who had breached their defensive line. Some of the Taliban had reached positions just 20 meters from where she needed to land. She knew that abandoning the Marines now would condemn them all to death or capture. Negative. "Reaper 6, we're coming in." Chen brought the helicopter down in the middle of the firefight, landing directly between the Marines and the advancing Taliban fighters. The rotor wash from the aircraft knocked several enemy fighters off their feet, giving Morrison's men a brief advantage in the close-quarter combat. "All Marines, move to the helicopter now," Morrison shouted over the sound of gunfire and rotor blades. His remaining men began fighting their way toward the aircraft, carrying their wounded comrades while laying down covering fire. Johnson traversed his door gun across the Taliban positions, his accurate fire keeping the enemy fighters at bay, while the Marines boarded the helicopter. Despite his wounds, he maintained steady, professional fire discipline, making every shot count as their ammunition dwindled. Private Rodriguez, the young Marine who had been wounded in the initial ambush, helped carry Sergeant Williams toward the helicopter. Williams had been hit again during the final assault and could barely walk, but he refused to be left behind. "Leave me," Williams gasped, blood staining his uniform. "Take the younger men." Rodriguez shook his head firmly. "No Marine left behind, Sergeant. That's not how we do things." As the Marines climbed aboard the overloaded helicopter, Taliban fighters pressed their attack with suicidal determination. Several enemy fighters reached positions just 10 meters from the aircraft, firing their AK-47s on full automatic. Chen felt bullets striking the helicopter's fuselage as she struggled to keep the aircraft stable. Morrison was the last Marine to reach the helicopter, continuing to fire his rifle at advancing Taliban fighters, even as he climbed aboard. A bullet struck him in the shoulder, just as Johnson pulled him into the aircraft, but he continued fighting despite his wound. "That's everyone," Morrison reported to Chen, his voice strained from pain and exhaustion. "Get us out of here." Chen pulled collective pitch and felt the helicopter strain against its maximum load capacity. The aircraft was carrying more weight than it was designed for, with 83 combat-loaded Marines crammed into every available space. The engine screamed at maximum power as she fought to gain altitude. "We're too heavy," Davis warned, watching the engine temperature gauges climb into the red zone. "The engines are overheating. We might not make it back to base." But Chen was determined to get these Marines to safety. She had brought them this far and she wasn't going to lose them now. As the helicopter struggled into the sky, Taliban fighters continued firing from the ground, their bullets striking the aircraft's fuselage and breaking windows. The overloaded helicopter limped away from the valley, its engine straining against the excessive weight while warning lights flashed across the instrument panel. Chen knew they were pushing the aircraft beyond its design limits, but she also knew that reducing weight was not an option. The overloaded helicopter struggled through the morning sky, its engines running at dangerous temperatures as Chen fought to keep the aircraft airborne. Every few minutes, new warning lights appeared on the instrument panel, indicating systems pushed beyond their operational limits. The weight of 83 fully equipped Marines was testing the helicopter's capabilities to the breaking point. 15 minutes into the flight, the port engine began showing signs of serious trouble. Davis monitored the gauges with growing concern as the engine temperature climbed steadily higher. "Phoenix, we're losing power on the port engine. Oil pressure is dropping fast." Chen adjusted her flight controls to compensate for the failing engine, knowing that losing power now would be catastrophic. The helicopter was already flying at minimum safe speed due to the excessive weight, and losing an engine would make controlled flight nearly impossible. In the passenger compartment, Morrison and his Marines sat in exhausted silence, finally allowing themselves to believe they might actually survive their ordeal. Many of the men were wounded, and all of them showed signs of the 24 hours of continuous combat they had endured. Young Corporal Henderson, who had asked Morrison if they would make it out alive, now sat quietly with tears streaming down his face. The relief of being rescued was overwhelming after the terror and desperation of their trapped situation. Sergeant Williams, despite his wounds, moved among the Marines, checking on the more seriously injured men. His leadership and steady presence had helped keep morale up during their darkest hours, and he continued caring for his men even now. "Forward Operating Base Chapman, this is Phoenix 1 requesting immediate emergency landing clearance," Chen radioed to the control tower. "We have engine failure and are carrying maximum casualties. Need medical teams standing by." The control tower immediately cleared all other air traffic and activated the base's emergency response protocols. Fire trucks and ambulances raced toward the helicopter landing pad while medical teams prepared to receive the rescued Marines. As the helicopter approached the base, the port engine finally gave up completely. The sudden loss of power caused the aircraft to yaw violently to the left, and Chen had to fight the controls to maintain directional control. Warning alarms filled the cockpit as multiple systems failed simultaneously. "Hold on, everyone," Chen announced over the intercom. "This is going to be a rough landing." The helicopter descended toward the landing pad faster than normal, its remaining engine struggling to control the rate of descent. Chen used every bit of her skill and experience to guide the crippled aircraft toward the ground, knowing that a hard landing was inevitable, but determined to get her passengers down safely. The helicopter hit the landing pad with a jarring impact that sent shockwaves through the entire aircraft. The landing gear absorbed most of the force, but the Marines were thrown against each other as the aircraft bounced and settled onto the tarmac. Despite the rough landing, Chen had managed to get everyone down alive. Medical teams rushed toward the helicopter as soon as the rotor blades stopped turning. Doctors and nurses helped the wounded Marines out of the aircraft, while Chen and her crew sat in stunned silence, finally allowing themselves to realize what they had accomplished. Johnson, his arm bandaged from his shrapnel wound, turned to Chen with a tired smile. "Phoenix, in 3 years of flying with you, that was either the craziest thing you've ever done or the most brilliant." "I'm still not sure which." Davis was already calculating the statistics of their rescue mission. 7 trips into hostile territory, 250 Marines extracted, multiple aircraft battle damage, and not a single fatality. The odds against this mission succeeding were astronomical. Over the following days, the story of the rescue mission spread throughout the military community. Chen had accomplished something that military strategists had declared impossible, saving the lives of 250 Marines through skill, determination, and incredible courage. Captain Morrison, his shoulder wound healing well, visited Chen in the hospital where she was being treated for exhaustion and minor injuries. "Lieutenant Commander, I wanted to thank you personally for what you did out there. You saved the lives of my Marines when everyone else said it couldn't be done." Chen looked uncomfortable with the praise, as she always did when people called her a hero. "Captain, those Marines never gave up fighting even when the situation seemed hopeless. I just gave them a ride home." 3 months later, Chen stood on the stage at the Pentagon as the Secretary of the Navy presented her with the Navy Cross, the service's second highest decoration for valor. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the face of overwhelming enemy fire, Lieutenant Commander Chen repeatedly flew into hostile territory to rescue surrounded Marines, displaying courage and skill beyond the call of duty." In the audience, Morrison and many of his rescued Marines watched proudly as their rescuer received the recognition she deserved. Johnson, his arm fully healed, served as one of Chen's honor guards during the ceremony. As Chen accepted the medal, she thought about the lessons learned during those terrifying hours over Afghanistan. She had discovered that sometimes the impossible becomes possible when courage meets determination, and that the bonds between service members can overcome any obstacle. Years later, when young pilots asked Chen about the rescue mission, she would always emphasize the teamwork that made it successful. "It wasn't just one pilot flying a helicopter," she would tell them. "It was Marines fighting impossible odds, crew members risking their lives, and support teams working around the clock. Heroes come in many forms, and that night they were everywhere." The rescue of the 250 Marines became legend in military aviation circles, proving that with enough skill, courage, and determination, even the most impossible missions can succeed. Chen's call sign Phoenix took on new meaning after that night, representing the ability to rise from the ashes of defeat and snatch victory from the jaws of disaster.